Hi, thank you very much for having me. So I'm sorry we can't all be together in person, but I'm happy to have the chance to talk to you remotely here. And thanks very much to all the organizers for making this happen. Okay, so I'm going to start off with a story. So just after finishing my second year in university, I traveled to Chiapas, Mexico for my first summer of linguistic fieldwork. And I traveled there to meet up with John Haviland, who was my undergraduate linguistics professor at the time and who is an expert on Mayan languages. Shortly after I arrived, we drove down winding mountain roads into the hot jungle lowlands of Chiapas and eventually arrived in a village called Campanario. After he negotiated my stay with a very surprised local host family, Haviland got ready to head back to the city. At the time, I was 20 years old. I didn't speak any Chol, which was the language, which is the language spoken there in Campanario, and I only spoke a little bit of Spanish. Suddenly, the 2 years of linguistics classes I had taken didn't seem like nearly enough, and as he got ready to hop back in his truck, I asked him to please remind me exactly what it was that I was supposed to be doing there that summer, and he said, make some friends, learn some Chol, and then he got in his truck and drove away. I have to imagine that Dr. Louise Banks, the fictional linguist and protagonist of the 2016 movie Arrival, understands the feeling that I had then. Probably a similar mixture of panic and fear, but also excitement began to settle in as she was being rushed by military helicopter from her university office to the site of a recently arrived spaceship. And there she is tasked with deciphering the language of the recently arrived heptapods. But the comparison is probably not actually fair. So just to unpack that comparison a little bit more, my first summer there in Mexico, I was to work on Chol, which is spoken today by around 200,000 indigenous Maya people in the state of Chiapas in southern Mexico. Whereas Dr. Banks's job is to work on Heptapod B. We'll come back to Heptapod A and B in a bit. But this is a language that's spoken by at least 2 or maybe 24 if you do the math with the spaceships. 7-limbed, so heptapod creatures from somewhere in outer space. Chol is a member of the Mayan language family, and today there are around 30 distinct, so mutually unintelligible, different Mayan languages. These languages are spoken by more than 6 million people in Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize. So you can see the languages here on the map, and this is the language Chol that I was studying that summer. So this is a large and vibrant language family. Linguists call these languages a family because they're descended from a common ancestor language, which is known as Proto-Mayan. So Proto-Mayan is reconstructed by historical linguists to have been spoken around 4,000 years ago, and all of the contemporary Mayan languages that you see here on the right, including Chol, are descended from this ancestor language. So again, to compare our fieldwork situations, I had a friendly host family. Dr. Banks has giant heptapods in a spaceship. I had an undergraduate research supervisor. Dr. Banks has military officers breathing down her neck and telling her to hurry up and get the job done. I had a body of work on these other Mayan languages, including some work already on Chol, so I wasn't starting from scratch. There was literature that I could read up on. Whereas, of course, there's no Learn Heptapod manual, no universal translator, and Google Translate is not going to work for Heptapod. I had an undergraduate honors thesis to write, which seemed very scary at the time, but Dr. Banks has impending world war if she doesn't get it right. So this is clearly a bit more impactful. And I had one more thing on my side, and that's universal grammar. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So in the rest of this talk, I'm going to talk a bit about universal grammar and language variation. So we'll see that languages vary, but they do so in constrained ways, and ways that we are beginning to understand as linguists, at least here on Earth. Then we'll turn to Heptapod A and Heptapod B, the 2 different languages spoken or used by these heptapods, and we'll talk a little bit about the writing system, of course, connecting to the theme of this conference. I'll talk a bit about linguistic relativity, so what impact might all this variation and difference among languages, both human and alien, have on thought. And then I'll end with some notes about linguistic fieldwork and language diversity. Okay, so universal grammar. So language sets humans apart from all other species on Earth. As we know, human babies are not very good at doing very many things. So they're not good at tying their shoes. They're not good at doing math. They're not good at feeding themselves, but they can learn any language to which they get sufficient exposure. And while children make mistakes along the path of language learning, even these mistakes are instructive. They follow certain patterns, and they give us information about what's going on in the language learning process. So by the time a kid reaches the age of 5, they've mastered a complex system of grammar that can organize sounds into words and words into sentences. And this gives them the ability to produce and understand an infinite number of novel utterances. And this is something that any adult who has tried to learn a language in adulthood can appreciate. So it's really a remarkable feat what babies are doing. How do kids do this? Many linguists argue that they have a head start. So what linguists call universal grammar is just the innate human capacity for language, whatever that turns out to be. Human children learn languages effortlessly and quickly and without explicit instructions because their brains are hardwired with the building blocks of language. Most of what we know when we know a language is implicit knowledge, right? So as I just mentioned, it's knowledge that nobody has explicitly taught us, even though sometimes we think we are teaching children to speak. Really, they are doing most of the work there on their own. And that knowledge that we as speakers can't usually articulate, right? So knowing a language doesn't mean that you can explicitly describe everything that you know. Our job as linguists is to understand and explain this implicit knowledge. So just to give a couple of examples of what I mean when I say implicit knowledge. So if I show you this picture in English, I might say there's a big, tall, gray spaceship there, right? And this sounds good. Whereas if I say tall, big, gray spaceship, this sounds weirder to me. And gray, tall, big spaceship, this sounds quite odd. So there might be specific circumstances or intonations you could use to make this sound okay, but in general, we just know that 1 is a better way to describe this than 2 or 3. And you can import this to any language that you might speak. You'll find there's a certain order that modifiers typically appear in, and this order is relatively fixed. And this is not the kind of thing that teachers are teaching kids in school, right? This is something that we just have implicit knowledge of. Here's one more example. So here are 2 sentences in English. Who did Louise ask to see her? And why did Louise ask to see her? And if you're a speaker of English, you know automatically, you know without having to think about it, that in the sentence in 1, Louise and her can refer to the same person. So who did Louise ask to see her? This can mean, who did Louise ask to go and see Louise? The sentence in 2, on the other hand, Louise and her must be different people. So why did Louise ask to see her? This can only mean, why did Louise ask to go and see some other her, right? And we just know this. We know this automatically, and this is not something that you learn in English class. So a question that a linguist might ask is, why is this? Why is it that these sentences that look almost identical, except for this word, mean such different things once we really stop to think about it? Okay, so what do linguists do? Linguistics is the scientific study of human language. So linguists study things like the implicit knowledge that I just gave you in those examples that speakers have about their languages. Linguists study how children acquire this knowledge, how languages might change over time, what basic principles human languages share, as well as how languages might differ from one another. So because linguistics is the scientific study of human language, when Dr. Banks's physicist counterpart in the film says this,
you approach language like a mathematician, you know that, right?
I will take that as a compliment.
she was probably thinking something like this, right? So he said, you approach language like a mathematician, you know that, right? And she said, I will take that as a compliment. Linguists are also not translators, so this comes up in the film a couple of times.
You are on the top. Everyone's list when it comes to translations.
No. So probably she was thinking something like this, right? So linguists are not necessarily translators. What they should be on the top of lists for is, for example, deciphering the structural properties of languages. So that's why Colonel Banks was actually there to see her. Linguists are also not necessarily polyglots. So some linguists do speak many languages, and indeed Dr. Banks in the film is supposed to have this characteristic. But many linguists do not, and they even take time to make memes about it. So I didn't make these, but many linguists will push back against the common misconception that linguists speak lots of languages. Okay, so what do linguists do? So as a linguist, one of the first things that Dr. Banks would want to know is if the heptapod's language has hierarchical structure. So what do I mean when I say hierarchical structure? Speakers of a language have intuitions about parts of a sentence which form units or phrases, and these phrases combine together hierarchically. So if we take an example like the sentence in 1, Louise and Ian befriended the giant aliens with 7 limbs, we have intuitions, again, automatically as English speakers, that some of these words go together more than others, right? So I can find chunks of words in these sentences like Louise and Ian, giant aliens, 7 limbs. These are all words that seem to go together. And I can find bigger units as well, right? So with 7 limbs, again, seems to go together. Befriended the giant aliens with 7 limbs also feels like a unit, right? So we have intuitions about this, and we can contrast them with strings of words which don't seem to form units. So giant aliens with, these don't feel like a coherent unit. And Ian befriended, aliens with 7. None of these feel like a unit the way that the words highlighted in blue in the first 3 sentences should. But we can also test these intuitions, right? So we can do better than intuitions. We can use tests to find out that these words really do go together. So for all the words in blue in 1 through 3, I can replace them with a word and keep the same meaning of the sentence. So Louise and Ian, I can replace this with they. Befriended the giant aliens from outer space, I can replace this with ones. Louise and Ian befriended them, right? I can also replace this larger unit. Or I could say Colonel Weber befriended the giant aliens from outer space. Louise and Ian did so too, right? And I can maintain the same meaning of the original sentence. Whereas the same is not true for these sentences at the bottom, right? There's no word that I can use to replace these strings of words and have the sentence mean the same thing. Okay, so what, right? So now we can take these units and look at them together. These are all the units here underlined that we identified in the last sentence. And we notice something interesting, right? So these units, or what syntacticians call phrases, are always nested inside of each other, right? So when we look at sentences and we pull out the units, we find that phrases are always nested inside larger phrases. We never find overlap like this, right? And this is true across languages. And so what does this mean? It means that we have hierarchical structure. So the study of how words and pieces of words are combined is called syntax, and syntacticians like me and like Dr. Banks study the structure in languages of the world. And we use tree diagrams like the ones here to model it. So you can think of the roots of a tree, or maybe, excuse me, upside down branches. Okay, so again, let's take this sentence. Louise and Ian befriended the giant aliens from outer space. And if we put it in a tree diagram, we get something like this. So note that each node on the tree, so each of these parts that I've put a blue circle on, represents one of the phrases that we identified above, right? So they're all nested inside of each other, giving us this hierarchical representation. Okay, so each node is a phrase. Another thing we know about human languages is that these phrases are organized around heads, right? So the head is the nucleus of the phrase. It determines what kinds of words it can combine with, and it also contributes the main meaning in a sense. So here's one phrase, wrote words, and I've highlighted the head here in blue. So this is a verb phrase. On whiteboards, this is what we call a prepositional phrase. So these little words like on that indicate location, and this is combining with the noun whiteboards. So we've got a verb phrase and a prepositional phrase. We combine those together, and now we can add on the subject, and we have our entire sentence, right? So again, each node is a phrase. So what all human languages, anyway, have in common is that groups of words form phrases. These phrases are nested in hierarchical structures, and phrases have heads, right? They have nuclei. But of course, human languages vary from one another. And one way in which they can vary is the order of elements internal to a phrase. So here's some examples of verbs and their objects in English, verb phrases. So read the book. And now here's the Japanese equivalent on the right, where I've put the verb in the same blue color, right? So read the book is literally book read in Japanese. Play a game play. Write words, words write, see Louise, etc. You get the idea. Okay, so Japanese looks like the mirror image of English when it comes to verbs and their objects. But it's also not just about verbs and objects. So now if we look at prepositional phrases in the spaceship, we see that again in Japanese, the order is reversed. The spaceship in, under the table under, to the tent, with a pen, etc. Again, you get the idea. Okay, so in English, the preposition comes before the noun. In Japanese, it comes after. It's actually called a postposition there. Okay, so this is a map that I pulled from WALS, the World Atlas of Language Structures, which is a very fun website to play around on. So each dot on this map represents a language. And here, the dots represent the order of verbs with respect to their object. So the dots in red are languages which are like English in that the verb comes before the noun in a verb phrase. And the dots in blue are languages which are like Japanese in that the verb comes after, right? So we see that we find both the orders all over the world. Okay, I'm going to go to the next map, and the next map is going to show you the order of prepositions with respect to their nouns. So things like to the store. There it is. I'm going to go back one more time. So verb and object, adposition, and noun. And what's really remarkable here is that you see that the languages that order the verb before the object are by and large the same as the languages that order the preposition before their noun, right? So I'll go back and forth one more time, and you can see that it's almost the same distribution. Okay, so what does this tell us? It tells us that yes, languages do make different choices about the order of elements inside of a phrase, but they also tend to make the same choice consistently internal to their grammars. So linguists talk about these patterns as parameters, right? So you can think of it like a switch. When the switch is flipped one way, heads in general appear to the left. When it's flipped the other way, heads in general appear to the right. And again, we find languages with these properties all over the world. So I've just listed some examples here. Okay, so what we've seen so far, human languages share certain principles in common, but we also find variation. We looked at this variation in terms of the ordering of certain elements internal to phrases, but we also saw that this variation is constrained. Right? So languages tend to make the same choice within their grammars. And it's parameters like this that give human babies a head start, right? So their job isn't to learn a language completely from scratch, but rather to determine certain parameter settings. So once a human baby starts to notice, for example, that verbs come before objects, the same baby can start making tacit inferences about the order of other elements in their language. The existence of parameters like this also give linguists a head start, at least when they're working on human languages. So I'm not sure this was very helpful to Dr. Banks. Okay, so again, comparing our fieldwork situations. That first summer when I was in Mexico, I was able to start formulating hypotheses about Chol based on data I was collecting, plus knowledge of some of the basic principles of human languages and parameters for cross-linguistic variation. Whereas Dr. Banks had no such luck. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about language variation and linguistic diversity. So I showed you examples from English and Japanese, but you might wonder, what about Chol, the language that I was working on that summer and continued to work on since? So if you look at the sentences here, you see on the left that verb phrases in Chol follow the same order as in English, right? So el hun, so el is read and hun is book. So read the book. Chol order looks like English. Ilsh Louise, same thing, see Louise. And just as we would expect, prepositional phrases also have the same relative order. So the preposition precedes the noun, again, just like English. Tiot yot, cha'an ah ian. So nothing big and surprising here. But of course, things get more interesting, or I wouldn't bother to show you this. So heads and Chol are on the left, just like in English. But when we look at an entire sentence, basic word order in Chol is actually verb, object, subject. So this is a relatively rare order among the world's languages. Fewer than 5% of languages have this basic order. So if we take a whole sentence like Louise read the book, Tik ele hunch Louise, we see that we get the verb, the object, and then the subject. Same with Ti tiaha lakpanyamil a heptapod, find heptapods, or sorry, find earth heptapods. So verb, object, subject. So how are we going to model this? Do we need to throw out our parameters? So let's go back to English and Japanese real quick. And I've given you a different sentence here. So 2 heptapods will write words. You can see the phrases nested inside one another. And I've also highlighted again the heads in blue, right? So write words, write is the head, and so on. So in English, all the heads are on the left. In Japanese, all the heads are on the right. And so I wasn't able to animate this for you in PowerPoint, but if you imagine that you just take each node and you twist it, you get from English to Japanese, right? All these nodes that I've highlighted here. Okay, I'll give you a second to stare at that. So we're twisting each node and then we get from English to Japanese. Now let's look at Chol, right? So again, Chol is verb, object, subject. So 2 heptapods will write words. It will come out in Chol as will write words to heptapods. So the subject last. And if you stare at this for a moment, you see that we can again twist and get from English to Chol. But we twist a different node, right? So all we need to do is twist this top node on the tree, and we get from English to Chol without any real problem. Okay, so what we just saw is that in English, Japanese, and Chol, all of these sentences share a common hierarchical structure, right? The structure is not changing. And as far as syntacticians can tell, this basic structure is shared by all human languages. But of course, in order to pronounce a sentence, we humans at least have to put one word before another word before another word. So if you think about the hierarchical structure as a mobile, right, like the thing you'd hang above a baby's bed, in order to pronounce this structure, we have to squish it flat, right? Imagine squishing the mobile between 2 panes of glass. So in order to pronounce the sentence, this is what we have to do. And we also saw that languages make different choices about how they squish this structure flat, but they tend to make choices internally consistent within their own grammars. Whereas heptapods, again, we don't know. Okay, so human languages vary, but they vary in systematic and constrained ways. Now let's talk a little bit more, as I promised, about heptapod A and heptapod B. Okay, so heptapod A, you hear in this clip from the film.
So let me translate for me.
Why are you here? Can you understand us? Where did you come from?
I'm not sure how well you could hear that, but this is the audible heptapod that you hear in the film. So in Ted Chiang's book, The Story of Your Life, on which the film Arrival is based, we learn a little more about heptapod A than we do in the movie itself, right? We don't get a whole lot of details about the language in the movie. So of this audible language that you might have heard in that recording, we learn from the book, it didn't follow the pattern of human languages as expected, but it was comprehensible so far. Free word order, even to the extent that there was no preferred order for the clauses in a conditional statement in defiance of a human language universal. It also appeared that the heptapods had no objection to many levels of center embedding of clauses, something that quickly defeated humans. Peculiar, but not impenetrable. So this is how Louise Banks is describing this audible language in the book. So let's unpack these a little bit. So what she's saying is flexible word order is not uncommon in human languages, but even given this flexibility, there are certain consistencies. So Joseph Greenberg was a linguist who looked for universals across the world's languages, and his universal number 14 states that the antecedent of a conditional, so the if clause in an if statement, will always precede its consequent or the result. And indeed, so here's an example from Japanese. We looked at Japanese earlier. So if it rains, is this part here, I will stay home, right? So we saw before that the order of heads internal to their phrases is very different in Japanese and English. But what we're seeing in this sentence is that just as Greenberg stated, the if clause is still preceding the result, right? If it rains, I'll stay home. So this matches the order in English. So in human languages, this is a trait that we tend to find. But in Heptapod, if we take some time to reflect on the heptapod's cognitive abilities, we might think that perhaps it makes sense that indeed they aren't constrained in the same way as humans are. What about center embedding, right? So here's an example of center embedding from English, what this means. So the cat fell, basic sentence in English. I can embed a clause in the center, right? So I can say, the cat that the dog chased fell, right? So this relative clause here, that the dog chased, is modifying the cat, and I'm embedding it in the center of this sentence. The cat that the dog chased fell, right? So no problem. So I should be able to do this again based on rules of how we combine things. So I should be able to add a relative clause to dog, right? The cat that the dog that the mouse scared chased fell. But this starts to become much more difficult to understand or even produce, right? Maybe you can get there, but it's pretty hard. And when we look at 4, the cat that the dog that the mouse that the bird saw scared chased fell. This is terrible, right? So this is really bad. And a really interesting thing about the degraded nature of English 3 and 4 is that you can't easily pin this to a rule of syntax, right? So we know that we can take a relative clause and we can use it to modify a noun, cat that the dog chased, right? So, and we should be able to keep applying that rule, but something goes wrong. Right? So the problem has been claimed to be a processing problem. Our human short-term memories have a difficult time storing up all of these elements and then later associating them with the verbs that come stacked on the end, right? Heptapods, on the other hand, are apparently unfazed by this task. And again, if you stop to think about what we learn about heptapods in the film, perhaps this makes sense. So Ted Chiang did his homework here. Okay, so while Heptapod A violates some human language norms, it does so in an expected way based on what we know about the heptapod's special cognitive abilities. And this reminded me of Chomsky's strong minimalist hypothesis. So this is the idea that language itself is an optimal solution to interface conditions. That is, our human languages are optimal solutions to human conceptual and articulatory or sensory motor needs, right? If it eventually turns out that all we have to do to predict properties of heptapod is to modulate our theories appropriately for heptapod's particular conceptual and articulatory abilities, then maybe the term universal grammar might not be so far off the mark after all. Okay, but let's talk about Heptapod B, right? This is a conference about writing, and I haven't said anything about writing. So while Dr. makes progress with Heptapod A, this audible language, the real focus in the film is on Heptapod B. So here's again a quote from the short story where we learn more about these languages. So this is what Dr. Banks replies to Colonel Weber when he comes in and plays that recording and says, I need you to translate this. She says, but the only way to learn an unknown language is to interact with a native speaker. And by that, I mean asking questions, holding a conversation, that sort of thing. Without that, it's simply not possible. So if you want to learn the alien's language, someone with training in field linguistics, whether it's me or someone else, will have to talk with an alien. Recordings alone are insufficient. Right, so unlike lots of sci-fi aliens, heptapods don't have humanoid vocal tracts. The sounds that they are making are not reproducible by humans, and we can't even be sure that our human ears can pick up all of the sounds that are being produced. And so this is why Dr. Banks turns to Heptapod B. This is a language that she can really interact with the heptapods in. So Heptapod B is described by Ted Chiang in the short story and in the film as well as being semasiographic. I'm sorry, I knew I was going to do that. A symbolic way of communicating information without a direct tie to phonetic speech. So while human writing systems differ from one another in important ways, they are all based in some way on spoken language. Right? So we know that in different writing systems, symbols might represent individual sounds. In other writing systems, in human languages, they might represent syllables or even entire concepts, right? So we do indeed find lots of variation, as you all know, in writing systems of the world's languages. But what they all share in common is that they are based in some way on a spoken language, perhaps a language that was spoken long ago, as evidenced by English's terrible spelling. Okay, we also know as linguists that many languages of the world do not have writing systems at all. So today there are somewhere around 7,000 languages spoken across the world, and many or most of these languages do not have standard writing systems. But they are equally expressive, equally rich, equally complex languages. So writing is a useful tool, but it's not a central part of the innate human cognitive capacity for language, right? It's sort of an add-on. So again, what all human writing systems do have in common, as I said before, is that the writing system is based on the spoken language. But this is very different from Heptapod, right? So Heptapod B, here's a description in Ted Chiang's Story of Your Life. The writing looked like fanciful praying mantids drawn in a cursive style, all clinging to each other to form an Escher-esque lattice, each slightly different in stance. So we learned that Heptapod B actually has no connection whatsoever to Heptapod A. It is not a written down version of the spoken language. In the film, these heptapod semagrams are beautiful, circular, swirly symbols. They look like something, they look like stains maybe that your coffee cup would make, and they're always changing and swirling through the air, right? So they're described in this way in the short story, and they look like this on the big screen. But again, the important thing here is that these are two completely distinct languages. Why have two languages? So as the linguist-physicist duo in the film speculate, the heptapods might similarly wonder why we humans aren't taking better advantage of these two distinct media. So here's another quote from the short story, because we do learn more about this in the story than in the film. So Dr. Banks says, for them, speech was a bottleneck because it required that one word follow another sequentially. With writing, on the other hand, every mark on a page was visible simultaneously. Why constrain writing with a glottographic straitjacket, demanding that it be just as sequential as speech? It would never occur to them being the heptapods here. Semasiographic writing naturally took advantage of the page's two-dimensionality. Instead of doling out morphemes one at a time, it offered an entire page full of them all at once. I actually realize I'm not sure how to pronounce this word, so forgive me. Okay, so while some people are disappointed to learn that I did not create the language for Arrival, often they're even more unhappy to learn that it's not really a language at all, right? So instead, the symbols in the movie are based on the beautiful artwork of Montreal-based artist Martine Bertrand. You see her art here. And while the filmmakers went to great lengths to achieve consistency across the different symbols used in the film, and even created a small manual of about 100 different symbols. One cannot learn Heptapod B the same way that one can learn Klingon or Na'vi. It's just not a full language. And given the consequences of learning Heptapod B, as Dr. Banks does in the story, creating such a language would be no small feat, right? So one can probably not fault the filmmakers for not having made a language that allows you to see into the future. Okay, so some advice from future so advice for future field workers from Dr. Banks as imagined by me, right? So step one, establish a relationship. So in the film Arrival, Dr. Banks approaches the daunting task of deciphering the Heptapod language as any good field worker would. Inside the ship, she's the first one to take off her spacesuit and approach the glass. And while theoretical linguists like me are interested in the abstract properties of language, so the formal system that allows us to put sounds together to make words and words together to make sentences, access to that system is not direct, right? We have to do it by working carefully together with speakers of the language we are interested in. And as Dr. Banks knows, establishing a positive working relationship is the first step of any data gathering activity. So this is something I think the film did very well. Step two, start small. Dr. Banks also knows that progress doesn't happen overnight, right? So despite the orders of the military generals to hurry up and get to the point, Dr. Banks insists that she has to start with the basics. Step three, don't assume too much. So though variation in human language is constrained, and we are reasonably confident about some of the basic properties shared by human languages, new discoveries get made all the time. So just like with any other scientific study, it's important to go to work on any language with an open mind. And for Dr. Banks, of course, this is even more important. So even seemingly easy concepts like asking a question or locating an event in time is not going to perhaps have a direct correlate in Heptapod. And it's this uncertainty about how an alien language might differ from human languages that makes the premise of Arrival so thought-provoking. And then speaking of thought-provoking, we'll turn finally to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So does this variation across human languages affect how we see the world? And then what about aliens? So the film Arrival, based on the short story by Ted Chiang, that's my sci-fi joke for you there, draws heavily on the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So this is named after Edward Sapir and his student Benjamin Lee Whorf, not the other Whorf. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, also known as linguistic relativity, is the idea that the language we speak constrains or even determines how we're able to view the world. So among human languages, which follow the same underlying principles and differ in interesting but ultimately pretty constrained ways, this proposal has been claimed to be not only wrong, but actually dangerous, right? So it's an easy way to other or exoticize people who speak differently from us. In the 1930s, Whorf famously proposed that Hopi, a Uto-Aztecan language spoken in Arizona, had no way to mark time. This absence of time in the grammar of Hopi, he claimed, corresponded with the Hopi people's conceptualization of how time worked. So according to Whorf, Hopi people viewed time as cyclical, whereas as English speakers, we view it as linear, placing events in the present, past, or future. And according to Whorf, this reflects our English speakers' obsession with linear time. But this turned out to be wrong. So Hopi marks time just like many other languages do, and there hasn't been any convincing evidence for a relationship between the Hopi language and any kind of radically different way of viewing the progression of time. Why can't I advance this slide? Oh, there it goes. Okay, so more recently, scientific studies have looked for effects on language on thought in more subtle domains, and color is a really famous area for study. So as English speakers, we can look at these three dots and naturally group them into two different shades, right? This dot here that I'm pointing at on my left is green, and these two dots I would call different shades of blue, right? So as English speakers, this is fairly straightforward to categorize. And you might find it surprising to learn that in Chol, the language I was studying that summer, all three of these colors would be grouped under a single label, yuyush, right? So Chol speakers would look at all of these and they would recognize that they're different colors, just as I can see that these are different shades of blue, but they would all be shades of the same larger category, yuyush. So now the question is, what about thought, right? Does having fewer words for colors mean that Chol speakers will understand or perceive color in a different way? And if we believe this about Chol, we have to believe the same thing about ourselves with respect to Russian, right? So in the language, in Russian, we actually find that there are three different categories here, right? So each color belongs to its own category. And according to Russian speakers, there is no single category in which you can group what we would call two different shades of blue, right? So Russian speakers and English speakers have different numbers of color words. And so linguists were interested in testing how does this affect how we perceive color. So in a color matching experiment, Russian speakers and English speakers are pitted against each other, and they're presented with a series of tables containing colored tiles across the spectrum of what we call blue. And their task was to match a new tile to one of the blue tiles above. And in this study, so here down at the bottom, Russian speakers were actually found to more quickly be able to discriminate between two blues that fell on either side of this lexical divide. But what's really important to note here is that the difference was a difference of 124 milliseconds. So this is interesting, but that's not what makes headlines. So 124 milliseconds isn't in the headlines when we learn about studies like this. So ultimately, linguists have found many interesting and small differences in terms of reaction time, for example, in looking at the world's languages. But in terms of major differences in worldview, this is a little bit harder to support. Okay, so if you're interested in this, I really recommend John McWhorter's book, The Language Hoax. It offers an accessible look into many of these kinds of studies and concludes ultimately that language's effect on thought are extremely subtle at best, right? So what is more remarkable, he argues, is what human languages have in common. And what we might conclude from all of this is that even though speaking different languages is an important part of our cultural heritage and our identity, different human languages don't distinguish us from one another in deep ways. Rather, they bring us together, right? So in fact, based on the deep commonalities among human languages, Noam Chomsky, the linguist who is shown next to my books in the photograph above Dr. Banks's desk, has famously stated that a visiting Martian, or maybe in the case of Arrival, a visiting heptapod, would view all human speech as essentially dialects of the same language. When it comes to the language of the heptapods, though, even the best linguists have to admit that all bets are off, right? So while some linguists have complained about the spotlight given to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis in the film, we have to remember that this is science fiction, right? Fiction being the operative word. And like all good science fiction, it does make you think, how could an alien's cognitive or linguistic system differ from our own? My interactions with the filmmakers also forced me to think, how would we get to work deciphering an alien language if and when the time comes? And while our knowledge of human language is only going to get us so far, the tools we've developed for linguistic fieldwork and analysis will be critical. Or at least I hope this is true, because if you Google alien linguistics, my name comes up very high on the list. Okay, and in the end, I think we as linguists can't be too upset about the media attention our field has received. Indeed, from this headline, you can see that we are almost cool. Okay, so to wrap up, we'll take you back to where we started. Learning Chol that first summer in Mexico and the years that I've been learning it since did not significantly alter my perception of reality, but some of my work has helped inform linguistic theory. And that first summer in Chiapas, I did make friends. Remember the advice I got from my professor, John Haviland, lifelong ones, along with a handful of godchildren. So one of them, Morelia Martinez Vasquez, who you see here behind her mother in this picture on the left, just finished her university degree in Mexico. And she's also been collaborating with me and other linguists to help research and document her native language. So she's planning to go on to do a master's degree in linguistics and to continue to work on Chol. A few summers ago, we collaborated on a project documenting word order variation across different dialects of Chol. So here you see her on the left helping or running this experiment. And here she is last year presenting a new collaborative project that she's working on with Carol Rose Little from Cornell to understand dialectal variation in Chol definiteness marking. So Morelia and native speakers worldwide, including here everywhere, are working hard to document and revitalize their languages. And so I just want to end on that note. And they were awarded the Best Student Presentation Award. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Jessica. This was a lovely talk. And I'm waiting for questions by the audience. In the meantime, so you said these were really your books we see on Amy Adams' desk?
That's right, yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, so that was one of my...
Such a super production had no budget to buy other books and they actually took your books?
They rented them. So they came to my office. I worked with the set crew. That was one of the things I did for the movie, is they came to my office, they took pictures of everything. They toured around the linguistics department. And then at some point they said, "What do you charge to rent out your books?" And I thought, what? Who has an answer to that question? So I said, make me an offer, and we funded departmental happy hours that year with with the money from renting books to filmmakers. But yes, those are my books. And also Lisa Travis, one of my colleagues at McGill, they used her books as well. I didn't have enough. I have a lot of PDFs.
But it's really realistic. So I have a question by Ben Young.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
So first of all, thank you so much for the talk, and also thanks for that work on Arrival. I think that it actually did a really, really good job of sort of popularizing, or like sort of communicating to the public what linguists actually do, and so I think that was great. So my question was, one thing I've noticed in a lot of sort of pop sci writing about linguistics is that it tends to be very, very misinformed about Sapir-Whorf stuff. Like, I just, you know, it seems like every single time there's any sort of pop sci article about linguistics, it seems to be like, sort of like, oh, Sapir-Whorf is true, despite the fact that that's really not the general linguistic consensus, especially like in the way you were describing it. Thanks again for bringing up the language hoax, by the way. That's I think that's a great book for lay people about that. My question is, like, how, as linguists, do you think that we should approach this? Like, what should we do to make sure that sort of stuff that's pretty far outside of what's considered, you know, accepted in the linguistics profession is not disseminated as much to the lay audience?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it's I find that it's a point of disappointment when I've given talks like this in the past. I think that people in general really want something like this to be true. They want it to be the case that you know, different languages sort of alter your perception. And I suspect, or an answer that I've given in the past, is that we really have to separate language and culture here. And I think that this is something that John McWhorter emphasizes in his book as well, that, you know, if I have learned French by living abroad in France for a year, then I might have an idea that I feel a certain way when I'm speaking French. But I think the question that I try to remind people that we have to ask ourselves is, you know, is it the grammar of French, or is it the, you know, the people that I was with and the way I was living and, you know, the context in which I learned the language? And so I think, you know, it's important to really distinguish the, you know, the core idea of linguistic relativity being that it's grammatical properties of the language. So we know that we know that cultures can differ from one another, but the question is, how much does that connect to the language, the grammatical properties of the language? Yeah, and I think reminding people, as John McWhorter does in the book, that it can be dangerous to take this too far, right? It's very,
Absolutely.
as I said in the talk, it's a very easy way to exoticize other people. But we know that, you know, any human can learn any other human language, and so we have to tread carefully there. But it doesn't erase the, you know, the interesting studies and the interesting work that's out there. So I'm not an expert in this area, but it certainly always comes up in the context of the film. So I've tried. I recommend John McWhorter's book. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yeah, the only thing I was going to say too is that I after watching the movie, one of the ways I was trying, sort of like the only sort of line I would fix that I decided was that when I can't remember her assistant or the gentleman in the movie, but he brings up something and then she says something about the Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis, and I was thinking that if you could just insert the line, oh, I thought that's generally rejected, and she responds, in humans. You know, there you go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another point. I mean, linguists have certainly complained, as I mentioned in the talk, you know, why did you let that in the movie? And I think it wouldn't be a movie otherwise, right? The whole point is, you know, it's an interesting way to think about linguistic relativity and how it might apply to languages that are so foreign or alien from our own. Yeah, so there are certainly parts in the film that I cringe at also. I always tell people I don't get to take really any credit for either the good parts or the bad parts. So one of the first things I did for the filmmakers was I got to read drafts of the script and basically review it, offer feedback on the different parts, especially that were connected to linguistics, and some things they took into account, and for other things, at some point, one of them pulled me aside and said, you know, Jessica, this is all very helpful, but really Hollywood's main audience are not linguists. And so we're going to get some things wrong here. And now you just get to join every other profession in the world that cringes when their field is represented on screen. So welcome to the club.
Well, again, thank you very much for everything. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Question by Yves Danziger.
Hi. Hi.
It's so nice to meet you
electronically.
Nice to meet you.
Well, if we're meeting, yeah.
Yes, I know your work, so it's nice to see you.
Yeah, and of course, yeah. Thank you very much. And so it's still on linguistic relativity. There's a lot to say, and I think you're right that you know, there's a large contingent of linguists who feel that this is, you know, dangerous, and who would actually prefer that it not be true, and will, you know, would like to suppress a lot of, or sort of, you know, provide more information to the public that, you know, this is not generally accepted and so on, except that there is work that suggests that to some degree, and you actually cited some of it. And I think, you know, when you say that 125 milliseconds, well, that's not a lot, obviously, you know, Lara Boroditsky and her students are, you know, working scientists, and, you know, 125 milliseconds difference, they published the work as a significant, you know, this is not a statistically insignificant in the context of the study. And I understand it's not going to, you know, may not make headlines, but it is a real result.
Yeah.
And I think there are other people who feel, you know, if we're going to get into the question of who likes what, who sort of feel that too much rejection of this and too much assuming that universal grammar and universality must be the case everywhere, and sort of rejection of variation has a whiff of imperialism to it. And that's the other, if you like, opinion side, or what do I like and what do I not like. So when we're talking about linguistic relativity, I think it is clear that this is not a blanket determinism. I don't think even, you know, anyway, I don't think there's any serious living scholar who would take that position, but I do think that there is a certain amount of work out there that's been making waves by what are sometimes called neo-Whorfians, that is very worth looking at and quite intriguing. Nothing that would, you know, make you shake in your boots, but actually taking some of this variation seriously from a cognitive perspective. And, you know, some of it actually relevant to writing and literacy. And you know, for example, just of interest to this group, the idea that writing systems themselves can make a difference to cognitive issues, that if you use a writing system like the Roman system that uses mirror images, you know, you think about the difference between the small b and the small d letters in Roman, then that particular perceptual difference is much more salient to you than if you don't write, or if you use a writing system that doesn't use that particular contrast. And we have actually, you know, respectable results to show that kind of thing. So I think, you know, linguistic relativity is of interest to people. Some people do find it kind of interesting and attractive, other, you know, and actually, so the question of what I like and what I don't like, you know, shouldn't really come into it. Both sides have their attractions and both have their sort of dangers. And there is some work, and I think there's nothing to be gained by sort of suppressing or obliterating it. If I could just say about Whorf, and I'm sorry you know, stuck this in the chat in the middle. I'm very amazed that you were able to sort of reply to me in the middle of your presentation. Don't know how you did that.
It was pre-recorded.
Okay.
That was an earlier me. That would have been impressive, yeah.
So as I read Whorf on Hopi time, and, you know, I don't actually know Hopi, so he could be wrong about this too, but he doesn't actually say there's no way of marking time or speaking about time. You know, he doesn't say there's no tense. He doesn't say there's no, what he does say is that words that refer to time or units of time, like day or summer, or even, you know, that they're not subject to singular plural, that they're not nominals. And so they don't, this is the argument, and, you know, one could argue against this too, but I don't think this is what's been refuted. I think that this has not really been seriously discussed, is that the idea would be that because they're, you know, we don't have the idea of 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, you know, that you might not see each day as a separate entity, that they could all be lined up together, right? Which is a feeling that comes, you know, maybe from calendars or other kinds of technology. Whereas in fact, and I'm getting this feeling more and more as I stay at home day after day, each day is actually a reoccurrence of the same thing. It's not a whole new individual, you know. That's a different way of considering it. And that was Whorf's suggestion when it came to Hopi time. So I don't think he ever really said, and this is one of the ways that, you know, the sort of, things can get misunderstood. I think there's a lot to be said on both sides.
Yeah, I agree completely. Thank you for those comments. And I think you're right that, you know, the extreme characterization of both sides, you know, of the work on linguistic relativity, but also the work on universal grammar, the extremes that that both sides sometimes accuse each other of are not helpful. And there is, you know, there's certainly interesting work out there.
Yeah. So we agree.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. A question by James Myers.
Yeah, just quick, we're running out of time. I just wanted to say that I'm not a fan of Baraditsky's work because I've looked at her stuff on Chinese specifically, and it doesn't hold up. It actually kind of relates to this time thing as well. There's a claim that metaphor for time in Chinese tend to be vertical rather than horizontal. And it's been very carefully followed up by Chen Zhenyu and other people, and it's just, none of her studies are replicable. So at least that one, the big point that is still McWhorter's point is just that if there's any effect, it's a very subtle one. But definitely in Chinese, the actual facts don't seem to hold up.
And a question by G.R. Osborne.
Hello, yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for the talk and for the movie. And I was just wondering if you could speak a bit about more about the question about the relationship between speech and writing. And you begin in your talk that you say that writing systems, as we know, are all based upon spoken language. So I wonder how other notational systems, things like mathematics, fall into this, like IKEA construction diagrams. Because one of the my takeaways from Heptapod A versus B is what they're saying is that these two modes, visual versus kind of time-based spoken, actually are ways of communicating very different things. They have different affordances. And even in your presentation, for example, there's all these diagrammatic presentations like showing how the trees, and if we twist that, it is a visual presentation of a very deep concept that would be much more difficult to just present both in speech and in written language without those diagrams. So I wonder if you could just talk a bit about that connection, because of speech and writing actually modeling different ways of thinking rather than being together. That's the general concept. I don't know, but I don't know if there's a specific question other than maybe in alien communication, if even thinking that it would be language-based is itself kind of a earth-based, ethnocentric way of thinking. So,
yeah, I mean, thanks. It's something I really like about the film and about the original short story is it really sort of pushes our idea of what an alien language might or might not be like. I would love to turn the question into discussion, though I'm not sure if there's time, because as I worried to Jan first in me, I don't writing systems, but I think it's really interesting, and the comparison to IKEA assembly instructions, maybe this is more appropriate, right? Heptapod writing apparently has nothing to do with the spoken language. It's just using a completely different modality. It says my internet connection is unstable. Am I okay? Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Any other question? No other questions. So thank you very much, Jessica, for joining us, giving this beautiful speech, and for all the work you have done.
Thank you for having me. And yeah, thanks so much. I'm sorry I haven't been able to be at many talks. The time zone difference is tough, but I'll try to catch some more. So thank you very much.
Thank you.